As children get older, they have more accurate evaluations of who they are. They're able to really see who they are, how good they are at certain things, and they have um, a better judgment of their competences. We also see as children age that they're who they think they are versus who they think they should be, so what we call the ideal self versus the real self, that gap begins to widen. Because they're able to see themselves in a more realistic fashion, they realize they're not as good as they used to think they were. Remember, very little children are egocentric. It's all about them. They think the world revolves around them. And we sort of get a reality check as we get older that we're not all that great. We're not as great as our parents told us. And sometimes that can be really harsh on people's self-esteem. The wider the gap is between our real self and our ideal self, the worse our self-esteem is. So it's important not only to boost up your children's self-esteem by helping them to gain competence, but also to give them an accurate dream of who they should be. That they shouldn't be dreaming that they're going to be the richest person in the world, or the most beautiful, or the most competent, or the most famous person who ever lived. They should have versions of themselves that are realistic, that are founded in reality. They can still dream, but it shouldn't be such an unreal dream that they could never achieve it. So you have to be careful of what dreams do you give a child. Because, again, if their ideal self is too untouchable, then that's really going to lower their self-esteem. Instead of being able to appreciate who they are, who their real self is, they see the gap between their real self and their ideal self, and that gap alone, even if they have competence, that gap can lower their self-esteem. Genetics is also a contribution to higher self-esteem. Some people are just born feeling better about themselves. So while self-esteem can be taught, self-esteem can also be inherited. The three areas that we say are really conducive to creating self-esteem is competence, like I talked about. That's probably the most important. Positive social feedback is important also. The school system focuses on social feedback as the most important. That is not the case. And parents today are also taught the importance of positive social feedback. Some research has said positive social feedback can be discouraging to children, especially if it's unrealistic. It can make them less motivated to achieve. So positive social feedback should be used sparingly. It should be used when the children actually do accomplish something worthwhile. Warm democratic parenting is also very important to self-esteem. This means that you're affectionate, you're sensitive to your child's needs, like when we talked about goodness of fit. It also means that you give children choices. That's what democratic means. You have choices in life. You are not the dictator of your child's life. As they get older, you become more democratic, so they get more and more choices as they age and become more responsible and competent. When you're talking about a little kid, a democratic parenting example may be, what type of cereal do you want to eat this morning? Rather than letting your young child decide everything, you give them a few options so that you're still in control, but at the same time it makes them feel like they have choices. Like I said before, self-esteem comes out of competence. So it means nothing unless it grows out of real achievements. If the child is not actually achieving anything, they are not developing self-esteem, they're developing entitlement. Alright, so let's talk about the teenage years. In the teenage years, your sense of self continues to develop. It's beyond physical, and it becomes much more psychological, much more abstract. So I'm a good person, or even recognition that it's not just black and white. So sometimes I'm a good person, sometimes I'm smart, sometimes I'm a good friend, sometimes I'm a bad friend. So it becomes more integrated, recognizing that there are different parts of yourself and yet you're still the same person. Self-esteem does go down in the teenage years. This is not nearly as bad as the movies make it out to be, but it does actually drop. Fortunately, towards the end of the teenage years, it begins to rise back up. Suicide is very high during the teenage years, and so this may play a part in that. This is when we see Erikson's identity versus role confusion stage. So teenagers are questioning who they are, where are they going to go in life, what career are they going to have. We often think of this as a teenager thing, but this does last usually into the 20s and even into the early 30s. Sometimes it can last longer than that, but you usually don't see it last much longer than the mid-30s. So these are some examples of how children would describe themselves. Remember, we talked about in the teenage years it becomes more psychological and abstract. So you have a 9-year-old, my name is Bruce, I have brown eyes, I have brown hair, I love sports, I have 7 people in my family, I have great eyesight, I have lots of friends, I live at a certain address, I have an uncle who's almost 7 feet tall, my teacher is Mrs. V, I play hockey, etc., etc. So it's all very real life, grounded, physical characteristics, some social characteristics. It's not very abstract, it's not very psychological. Getting a little older, this is not 111, this is 11 and a half years old. My name is Anne. I'm a human being, a girl, a truthful person. I'm not pretty. I do so-so in my studies. I'm a very good cellist. I'm a little tall for my age. I like several boys. I'm old-fashioned. I'm a very good swimmer. I try to be helpful. Mostly I'm good, but I lose my temper. I'm not well liked by some girls and boys. I don't know if boys like me. So it's becoming much more abstract. Now when we get into the teenage years, this is a description by a 17-year-old. I am a human being, a girl, an individual. I am a Pisces. I am a moody person, an indecisive person, an ambitious person. I'm a big, curious person. I am lonely. I am an American. God help me, because of course she's a Democrat, so she's not proud of being American. I am a Democrat. I'm a liberal person. I am a radical. I am a conservative. Okay, so we have integration of two different sides of her. I am a pseudo-liberal. I am an atheist. I am not a classifiable person, i.e. I don't want to be. Okay, so it becomes very, very abstract, very almost poetic. And this is because we're able to start understanding that we have different sides to ourselves and yet we're still one person. It's not black and white. There's gray in the middle. So you're integrating all of these different parts of yourself. And remember, this is not just socialization, this is not just education, this is also the brain is physically changing. It's growing, the brain goes through growth spurts, and each of these stages of development, we see the brain physically growing and changing as we are able to think of ourselves differently. Alright, so we become less physical, more psychological as we get older. Our self-portraits or our self-concepts become less concrete, less grounded, and much more abstract. And again, this we talked about Piaget before. This definitely follows the stages of his theory. We're more self-aware. We're more able to recognize that we're part of different groups, we're part of different cliques. We are an individual, so differentiation means understanding and being comfortable with the fact that you are an individual, that you're autonomous, that you are not simply in a relationship or a member of another person. This is kind of a hard concept to describe. When babies are born, they're completely undifferentiated. I mean, you literally start out as part of your mother's body. And so it's like you don't exist, but your mother exists, and you are simply a part of her body. As we get older, we become different than our mother, or differentiated. And so we start realizing more and more that we are our own unique person. And we see this in self-descriptions, and self-concepts as children age. They become more and more individual, more differentiated. As we talked about before, we also become more integrated, more coherent, recognizing that there's different parts of ourselves, that we can be different in different situations, and that all becomes integrated into our self-concept. Now, we mentioned that self-esteem does dip in the teenage years. This is actually much more common among white females. You don't see this nearly as much in boys. You also don't see it as much in minorities as you do in white females. There's a lot of reasons this could be. There could be something biological that's occurring. There's also a lot of pressure that's put on the white culture to achieve, to get into certain schools, to really excel in your grades. Also, there's a lot of white young women on television, and so you identify more physically with somebody of your own race and your own sex. So if you are a young white girl, and you see young white women on TV with perfect bodies, you are not that perfect, then there may be more pressure on you to look or to act a certain way because this is what you're being exposed to so much on television. So there's a lot of theories of why this happens, and nobody is exactly sure what's causing it. Alright, self-esteem is also affected by what we call the little fish in the big pond syndrome, or big fish, little fish. So if you're a big fish in a small pond, then you feel a lot better about yourself. If you're a small fish in a big pond, then you feel worse about yourself. And this is all about social comparison. So if you're the big fish in a little pond, then you're bigger than all the other fish in that pond. You are better than all the other people around you. And so we're very relativistic relative to where we are in life right now. I feel good about myself, or I feel bad about myself. So you could be super smart, and if you are around ordinary people, then you really feel good about your intelligence. Then you go to a Mensa conference, and suddenly you are not the smartest person in the room anymore, and you begin to feel pretty bad about your intelligence. Okay, so that's important to think about when you are raising children, or even for yourself. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where there's too much competition. A little competition is good because it helps you grow. Just like they say a goldfish grows to the size of the bowl that it's in. It's the same with us, with our personal development. But at the same time, if there's too much competition, then it's very discouraging. As teenagers become adults, the teens who showed low self-esteem during the teen years become adults who suffer consequences because of that. They tend to have poor physical and mental health, more mental illness, more obesity, more likely to have a heart attack. They also do worse in their career, so they don't get as good of a job, they don't make as much money, they're more likely to go to jail and have higher levels of criminal behavior, more likely to go to prison. So they suffer in a lot of different ways than teenagers with high self-esteem who generally excel. So self-esteem is really important. The school system does get that right. Unfortunately, they just try to build self-esteem in the wrong way. Now, teenagers do tend to have poorer self-esteem generally, but like I mentioned before, it's not as extreme as TV shows and movies make it out to be, and they do tend to get their self-esteem back after the teenage years. According to Erikson, of course, teenagers are going through the stage of identity versus role confusion, Erikson said, because he's not alive anymore, that modern civilization grants what we call a moratorium for teenagers. And this is basically a pause on life. It used to be that when you became a teenager, you were married, you started having kids, maybe you went to war if you were a male. Women would be running their own households at a very young age. And so you went from your parents' house to your husband's house, and you immediately needed to be working. Maybe even before the teenage years, you were holding down a job. And so there really wasn't time to worry about your identity. Now, Erikson says that moratorium is a good thing because we should be able to develop our identity. If you look at a theory of identity development, this was not developed by Erikson, but it does use his term moratorium. This is called Marcia's ego identity statuses. So this includes 4 statuses of where your identity is at the moment. Diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and then identity achieved. Diffusion is, maybe your parents didn't know everything. Maybe I'm not who they said I was, but I don't really care that much. It's not that big of a deal to me. There's no crisis in your life, and there's no commitment to your identity. You're just sort of diffuse, floating along through life. Foreclosure is I am committed to who I am without ever questioning it. So commitment without a crisis. I'm Catholic, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to become a doctor, whatever, because that's what my parents told me was right, or that's what my culture told me was right. Think of the Nazis. They were very much in foreclosure. I'm not going to question this. In their case, it was dangerous to question, and so they were often very committed to these beliefs without ever questioning it. Moratorium, this is the pause. Who am I? What is right? Who will I become? You're in an identity crisis, but you haven't actually committed yet to what your identity is, who you are as a person. Eventually, hopefully, you will have achieved an identity, and this is where you are committed and you have questioned it. You have now decided on your own beliefs. It might still be the same as your parents or your cultures, but you have questioned it and made that decision. So I can make my own life choices. I know who I am. This is a chart of the different commitments that might help you to understand it a little bit better. So you have on the first layer, no crisis experienced, and then has there been a commitment made or not? So if there's no commitment, you're in diffusion status. You haven't yet thought about or resolved any identity issues, failed to chart directions in life. If commitment made without a crisis experience, you're in foreclosure status. So you seem to know who you are, but you've latched onto an identity prematurely with little thought. My parents are Baptist, I'm a Baptist, it's just the way I grew up, so that's how it is. And then the next row, that you have experienced a crisis. So if there's still no commitment made, you're in moratorium. You're currently experiencing an identity crisis, actively raising questions, seeking answers. Whereas if there has been a commitment made after a crisis, you're in identity achievement. So you've resolved your crisis, you've made commitments to your goals, beliefs, and values. You really did soul searching, and now you know what you believe, what you don't. This is a chart of identity status compared to age. So you can see at the younger ages, identity achievement, which is the light blue, is very low, which is not surprising. You haven't lived very long, so it's hard to figure out who you are. As you get older, into the mid-20s, more and more people have achieved a sense of who they are. Identity diffusion starts to decrease. Foreclosure also decreases. Foreclosure is pretty high when you're young because you identify with your parents. What they say goes, and that's just how it is. Moratorium is the questioning, and so that starts to increase in the teenage years and continues through into middle adulthood and beyond to some degree. But it will drop off usually after the mid-20s to mid-30s. Okay. Um, if you look at the sexes, men and women tend to achieve identity around the same time. It's very similar. However, men usually focus more on who they are in light of their career, what they're going to do for the rest of their life. Whereas women often focus more on their relationships, on family, on children. And so, depending on how the test for identity is set up, it can make women look like they're behind on identity achievement. So, if it's what are you going to be for the rest of your life, what are you doing with your life, what are your career goals, women are a lot slower to develop their career identity. However, if you reverse that and ask men questions about family, children, marriage, you'll see that they're also behind, in a sense, on that. So the priorities are different in what your identity is going to be. All right, so identity achievement. If you look at identity, there's different types of identity, just like with gender. Some identity is based on relationships, some on careers. We also have an ethnic identity. This begins in infancy. Children really begin to understand what their particular culture is. We also have a vocational or job identity, which becomes, if you've been around children, you know it becomes more realistic as they get older. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a ballerina / archaeologist. I don't know how I was going to manage to juggle those two careers, but I was pretty sure I could handle that. Also, somewhere in there, I wanted to be a volcanologist and work with volcanoes. As we get older, we realize that there's goodness of fit. So that means that we are born more able to do certain things than other things. I don't like stress. I don't like a lot of high pressure. So I would never want to work on Wall Street, for instance. It is not in my personality to be in such high stress situations. So that would be a bad fit for me. Whereas somebody else might love that and really excel in that sort of environment. So what influences how we achieve our identity? The development of our brain and our thinking abilities or cognitive development, how open we are to new experiences. Now that's really interesting because you can't figure out who you are unless you've done things in life. So if you are just sitting in a little protected bubble, literally or metaphorically, you don't really know who you are because you haven't experienced things. You don't know what you like, you don't know what you enjoy. And so people who have a really closed off, boring, sheltered life have poor achievement identity. And we're seeing more and more of this with the helicopter parenting movement because children experience so little in life. They're not allowed to take any risks. They're not allowed to do things on their own. They really don't know who they are, what they like, what they want to do in life. So you have to have experiences in order to know who you are. Also, warm democratic parenting shows up again in identity achievement. This is you're allowing your children to make choices. You're allowing them to take risks. You're not being a helicopter parent. Also, if you are part of a culture that encourages exploration, which the American culture traditionally does, has done, and still does to some degree, although it's changing. Whereas somebody in North Korea is going to be in foreclosure because there are consequences to questioning. You do not want to question. You could be killed for questioning. Your family could be killed. It could be a really bad thing to question your beliefs. And so the North Korean culture really encourages foreclosure and does not encourage exploration.